my commentary on Isaiah 53, verse by verse, as it covers me. Not Jesus Christ, not the people of Israel, the Jewish people. Isaiah 52 ends with verse 12. Isaiah 52, 13, 14, and 15 is a completely new chapter. The very beginning of Isaiah 53. In other words, Isaiah 52, and there are many references there to the servant, the Jewish people, as God often and quite frankly always refers to them. He never refers to them as his righteous servant. 52 ends at verse 12. Picking up with 52 verse 13 is really starting Isaiah 53 verse 1. It just got divided improperly. There's a lot to that, and I have it in my book. Isaiah 52 verse 13. Indeed, and this starts out in quotes. 13, 14, and 15 are a multiple quote verses. In other words, this quote that 13 starts with ends at the end of verse 15. Indeed, my servant shall prosper, be exalted, and raised to great heights. My servant shall prosper, be exalted, and raised to great heights. This is in midrash form. That's when you read a verse and generally break it down into parts and then give commentary on each of the parts. My servant is now the sinful, blemished, and disfigured Gentile who becomes, quote, my righteous servant, close quote. That's by God in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11. After passing the test of devotion in Isaiah 53, verse 10, when he makes himself an offering for guilt in a covenant with God, agreeing to go through the suffering of God's fire of refinement. There's much more on that when I get to verse 10 and 11. God's righteous servant is the man who is made suitable in the Lord's fire of refinement of punishment, maltreatment, chastisement, bruising, and crushing. Now the key to this is the book of Ezekiel. He literally goes through everything that the man of Isaiah 53, the righteous servant, goes through, except he's not crushed with disease, he's not familiar with disease, and he is not wounded. All these other words, maltreatment, punishment, chastisement, bruising, crushing, that are in Isaiah 53, apply to him too. And again, I have a lot more on that. And the purpose of this is to make the many righteous. That's what this story is about. Chapter 53. It starts out with the people who need righteousness. And that's the first 6 verses, and I'm getting to them. And they are multiple quote verses also. Quote starts at verse 1 of chapter 53 and ends at the end of verse 6. And that's what it's all about. Here's this man. You're going to see what kind of problems he has and how lowly he was, and rises up to be God's righteous servant, speaking to God. As it turns out, in the day of the Lord, and you can find this in so many of my other videos, which is this day. Because Jeremiah 31 talks about a time to come, and it connects with Malachi 3, chapter 3, which is the last page of the prophets, that God speaks to his prophets, and God prophesies a day of the Lord. And it says, so to make the many righteous, and through him the Lord's purpose might prosper. In the day of the Lord, there are 4 men to come. This is the only unfulfilled prophecies of God himself. 4 men to come. That would be the righteous servant himself, the prophet like Moses, who's never appeared, Elijah, and we find he's the messenger in Malachi 3, and of course the anointed one, Moshiach, the descendant of King David, from Isaiah chapter 11. Now, as I said, this is verse by verse and how I fit them. God came to me at birth, but did not speak to me as he did to Ezekiel immediately when his spirit lit upon Ezekiel. Then he could hear God speak. God is in his spirit. I have a little more on that in here, but it's also in many other videos. There's only one description. And the sages knew. The sages knew, although it's totally ignored today in Judaism, who says this Isaiah 53, the Jewish people as one man, Israel, a patriarch. You had to have the description. And they believed and said the descendant of King David of chapter 11, the Moshiach, was described in Isaiah 53. They even had a name for him in the Babylon Talmud, the leper scholar. And that's because he's familiar with disease, crushed with disease, and yet by his knowledge, he makes the many righteous. Not by his death, not by his blood, not by crucifixion, by his long life. And again, it starts out with the first 6 verses where we see there are people suffering a sickness. And I'll get to that in just a second. So I, the righteous servant Elijah, though my name is Keith, clear the way for the building of the 3rd temple. Because God says in Malachi verse 1, chapter 3, behold, I am sending my messenger to clear the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek shall come to his temple suddenly. So the purpose of God that's not stated in Isaiah 53, it just is a purpose that might prosper, is returning to his temple, which means it has to be rebuilt. So when his messenger is clearing the way for him, it's clearing the way for the rebuilding of the 3rd temple of God. And this purpose of Elijah is a purpose that might prosper also. See, that's the connection. Elijah is supposed to draw the families of the Jewish people back together and do it through Judaism. He is to make them righteous. What is the man of Isaiah 53 called? God's righteous servant, the teacher of righteousness. And for what? A purpose of God that might prosper. Which is what? Building a 3rd temple. And God says, if Elijah is not successful, when I do come, I'm coming with utter destruction. I will strike the land with utter destruction. That's how serious it is to be able to find Elijah. And that's why you have to have a description. 4 men to come, 1 description. It's implicit, it's explicit. And there's no other way to look at it. And the sages would agree with me, I'm quite sure, that you have to have a description of these men. The things I hear on the internet, on YouTube, from the rabbis who talk about Moshiach, and when he gets there and people ask them, how do we know he's here? This and that and this. The answers are so varied and to me so ridiculous. You know, you're going to know who he is because he fits this description. That's what it's for. It's for the day of the Lord. Now, what's the day of the Lord about? Well, Jeremiah says, see, a time is coming, the ruined land, the desolate land will be rebuilt again. The cities restored, Jerusalem rebuilt to a size greater than antiquity, which it is today. The land shall bloom again. This all started in 1948. See, your time is coming. I'll make a new covenant with you. Not like the covenant I made with your fathers out of Egypt. I'm going to forgive your sins and I'm going to remember them no more. And this will cause Torah to be written on your heart, which is a metaphor for basically when Jewish people find out God is back and God is doing what he said, that's going to draw. That's going to get these sick people back that are in the first 6 verses to righteousness. So there's a new covenant. So we look at Jeremiah, you got these 3 seed times coming, and you say, okay, well that's today. Because the land blooms again, Jerusalem's rebuilt, so the new covenant has to be here. What do we know about that? Who's going to deliver it? Well, you ask yourself, who delivered the first one? Moses. Who's supposed to come? A prophet like Moses. Well, what about the covenant itself? What else do we know about it? Malachi 3 verse 1. I'm sending my messenger to clear the way before me, and I shall return to my temple suddenly. And the angel of the covenant that you desire is already on the way. It's the day of the Lord. That's what ties the two together. And you got to have a prophet like Moses. You got to have you have to be able to describe a man who's a prophet of God. That's number one. And then he has to be able to do the things Moses did, which primarily is write the Torah. The Jewish people haven't been in bondage since the Israelites left in the Exodus. So that's not the issue. And a man who can talk to God face to face, friend to friend. So this is what we're looking for. This is what everybody should have been looking for from the beginning. But particularly after the lands have become desolate and restored as they are today, which did not happen with the Assyrian Babylon exiles when they returned. They couldn't even go in to the northern kingdom because it was inhabited by Gentiles. That's another story too. But they didn't revive all of Israel as it is today. This is when it occurs, and I can tell you it is occurring because he's been training me up for this for 13 years now. We're just now starting to make a splash and let people understand what's really happening. He's here. It is the day of the Lord. There's 3 Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it is unquestioned, at least in this room, the clear winner is Judaism. There ain't any question about it. And rightfully so. What other people have suffered as they have. So this is what we're looking for. The man being described, when all the verses are taken together, is a sinful man whose life had been lowly, full of grievous events, serious injuries and wounds, a man of pain and suffering, familiar with disease, that the Spirit of God alights upon, to the crown of God's righteous servant who makes the many righteous and rises to great heights. Other scripture says the stock of Jesse. Jesse is the father of King David, which we find in the first verse of chapter 11 of Isaiah. The stock of Jesse that has remained standing shall become a standard to peoples. Nations shall seek his counsel, and his abode shall be honored. That's Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10. I, the righteous servant David, though my name is Keith, will have an abode that is humble when the Lord cuts me off from the land of the living. In Isaiah 53, well, I'll get to it. It happened to Ezekiel too. From the world of material things in society to fit Isaiah 53 verse 8. And in the end, my abode is one to be honored in Isaiah chapter 11 verse 10. From a poor man to a rich man, with the many as my portion, and the multitude as my spoil. Prosperous and held in high regard by many, and the multitude of the Jewish people. Verse 14, just as the many were appalled at him, so marred was his appearance, unlike that of man, his form beyond human semblance. This is the beginning of identifying God's righteous servant in Isaiah 53 as a man with disfigurement, because not only is he afflicted by God, he is also blemished. And I'll get to that. It's very important that was put into Isaiah 53. Usually you think of afflicted with a disease, but these are separated. Another affliction is disfigurement at birth. King David would have nothing to do with the blind, the crippled, the lame, because it was a sign in those days that God did not like you. He had nothing to do with him. You know, he's not a man without defects, such as lambs and rams for a sin offering and guilt offering in the Torah. In other words, God had Isaiah write that in, that this man was disfigured and afflicted with disease for one main purpose. Do not try to use the animal sacrificial atonement worship laws of Leviticus for this chapter, for this man. And that's just what the Christians did. And one rabbi that I know of, human sacrifice is what that would be. But you know what you can't sacrifice? A defective, blemished lamb or ram. You can't do it. It's not acceptable and won't be accepted by God. And the Christians can't see it. They just can't see it. They're blind. As they say the Jewish people are, that Isaiah 53 is prophetic of and describes Jesus Christ. I don't see him fitting a single verse, save one. But that's for another time. So, how could a man today fit the description of the Lord's righteous servant in Isaiah 52:14, with his appearance marred, unlike that of man, a normal man, unlike normal men? And just so marred, he shall startle many nations in verse 52:15. So he's marred, his appearance is so awful you can't look upon him, it sounds like. But the truth of it is, he goes on to startle many nations. Nations seek his counsel. He makes them many righteous. So he is a person who can be looked upon. There is one way and still be alive to fulfill verse 52:15, to describe a man who comes when the land blooms again, the ruined cities have been rebuilt, and Jerusalem has been rebuilt to the size as it is today, which began about 70 years ago. By the way, God dictated a book to me, Isaiah 53 in the day of the Lord. We had put together over almost 85 videos covering every single chapter, among other things. And in addition, the second book he had me type, he dictated it. I had to learn everything. It's not straight dictation. It takes a lot of give and take, this and that, but every single word, every sentence, every paragraph, every chapter, the entirety of the book is God's. It's just like the Torah. Both of these books, and that's what I'm using. I mean, in other words, he had me put this together. I was an atheist for 50 years. I didn't know anything about Judaism. I didn't know what a Tanakh was. I didn't know what a Hebrew Bible was. I never heard of anything like Isaiah 53. I never associated with religious people. I had no training. When I say I was an atheist, I was adamant. There is no God. And it's partly because, like so many people like me, when you go through tremendously bad things, you just start thinking there's somebody who looks favorably on me. Nothing good ever happens. And I'll bear my own problems, thank you. That kind of attitude. Now, if I were to be seen with all of my injuries from accidents and surgical operations at one time before healing, together with my congenital disfigurement, my appearance and features would be marred from that of normal man. This is my history. I was born prematurely in the 7th month without my right pectoral muscle, with a shorter right shoulder, and a withered arm. There's just no muscle on it, my right arm. I had a 4-inch wound from surgery to remove tissue above the missing right pectoral when I was 2 years old, my first surgery. My feet would have 3rd-degree burns from standing on the ashes of hot coals at a 4th of July celebration when I was 4. My right knee would be a gaping wound from being impaled upon a broken glass bottle, Coca-Cola bottle. They almost took that leg off. They didn't think I'd ever be able to use it. But you would say a miracle happened. One particular doctor who could repair it walked by that hospital door, and my mom actually knew it. He had repaired my great-grandmother's hip that she broke when she was about 90 years old. And this is back in the early 1960s. So the nursing wasn't near as advanced as it is today. But anyway, he saved my leg. My left knee would be sliced open from broken glass. I crawled over playing a game when I was 11. My 2 front teeth would be gone, knocked out by a telephone receiver when I was 12. Each foot would be pierced twice with nails. Were they 16? I stepped on at a construction site when I was 17. That's a funny story. They went through my shoes and came up through the top. Left foot and right foot. My torso would be opened from the top of my rib cage vertically down to the pelvic bone from surgery to repair a .22 caliber gunshot to my abdomen. It went in through my front right side and came out over here on my left back side. It was just like an angle, almost straight across through me from about 2 feet away. And it pierced my bladder, colon, and intestines, and that was when I was 18. My upper jaw, the teeth, gums, and bone would be severed from my skull from orthodontic surgery, with my face swollen to twice its normal size when I was 38. It was surgery done to try to realign my top teeth with my bottom because I had a perpetual headache, one for almost 27 years of suffering. And the stories behind all these accidents and events and how I survived them is very interesting, and that's what the second book's about. It's called The Life of the Righteous Servant, God's Righteous Servant of Isaiah 53, which he also dictated to me, even though it was my life. And it's primarily to show how I fit these verses, because that's why he came to me at birth but didn't talk to me till I was 50. It's to make sure I fit these verses. You know, he said he came to Jeremiah at the womb, and he was a priestly man who had a great life doing God's work, even though he was one of the Babylon exiles. God came to me for a different purpose, to make sure I had a life of suffering, to make sure I fit these verses, and to prepare me in all kinds of other ways that I didn't know. He basically orchestrated my life without my knowledge, and me all the time being an atheist. But these stories are in that book. The first 7 chapters are just about me. That's pretty easy to read, just accidents that happen. And then it picks up with the chapter where he speaks to me for the first time. And then there's an additional 7 chapters culminating with what I'm reading to you right now. It's called chapter 16, Isaiah 53, Keith McCarty, verse by verse. That's what he had me write down. The skin of my chest would be open from a 6-inch in diameter circular cut to remove skin cancer when I was 43. My torso was opened again to remove a 6 to 8-inch malignant cancerous tumor that had burst through my colon when I was 44, and again in my 50s for abdominal hernia mesh surgery. I'm 63 today. God spoke to me at 50. As I said, he's been training me up for this for 13 years and teaching me all this. My left hand would be broken from a fall on a tennis court when I was 28 and broken again walking on stones in a creek when I was 55. My ankles would be bruised and swollen from severe sprains while playing basketball and running at various ages. My chin would be lacerated from striking a wall at the end of a foot race when I was 21, and I would be covered with the childhood diseases of measles and mumps. Now, if you could just imagine all that at one time, before healing, it's kind of like the Passion of the Christ. They say he fits all these things. He had nails in his hands and his feet, and he had been whipped. I'm sure his back was lacerated. But in any event, this man's supposed to live. This is how a man could fit the description of Lord's righteous servant in Isaiah 52:14, and just so he shall startle many nations. Kings shall be silenced because of him, for they shall see what has not been told them, shall behold what they never have heard. So that's Isaiah 52:15. And I can promise you, Judaism, the rabbis, Christians, these are things they had never been told, and behold what they have never heard. That's what this is. And, despite this language being in here, and God put it in here for a reason, had Isaiah write it, just as he has me write, just as he had Moses write. That's how the book came together, the Hebrew Bible. He had it all written, not just the Torah. Okay, so, nations, the Gentiles, startled, and kings, leader of nations, silenced by seeing the following. God's righteous servant, his servant David, Elijah, and the prophet like Moses as one man, hearing that God's righteous servant arise in the time to come of Jeremiah 31, which is the day of the Lord. That God's righteous servant is the only man to come who is described in the scripture and is inherently and implicitly the anointed one, David. God calls, they call him King Moshiach, Rambam did. And he's thought of as being a king. Ezekiel, you only see the anointed one, Moshiach, in chapter 11. And God just says, my spirit's going to light upon a descendant of King David. And then in Ezekiel, and he calls him my servant David, a shepherd. But back when Rambam was writing, and when the Talmud was put together, kingdoms were, well, as you've heard, there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. So if there's a descendant of David coming back, then it's thought that the Davidic dynasty would be resurrected. Well, that's not going to happen today. And God knew when this time to come was going to be, for the most part, to the very day. But, and that Israel will be a democratic country. So, forget all the kingdoms and this and that you hear taught about this Messianic era that the rabbis teach. That the Jewish people throughout the world are forgiven by God of all their iniquities and sin by God's written word in the day of the Lord. That's under the new covenant. The Christians aren't going to believe it because they took that new covenant. No, they didn't take it. They said it's been abolished. It's obsolete. We have a newer covenant, and that's Jesus Christ. That's the only way you can find righteousness is through faith in Jesus and the resurrection. You can't be righteous under the law. Okay, I can only put a half an hour on my camera at a time, and it just ran out. But let me pick back up and keep going. That heaven is being created for only the Jewish people. That God's righteous servant, like Isaiah 53, is a Gentile. That's going to floor everybody. There are Christians who believe that man describes Jewish, and you can better believe Judaism does too. Even though not the name described in Isaiah 53, but the Moshiach of Isaiah chapter 11. Well, he's not. And God had good reasons for that. Very good reasons. And that's in the beginning. When we make it to Israel, I'm going to convert Orthodox and become a Jew. That Jesus, being a Jew, cannot be God's righteous servant. And there's one reason right there. Isaiah 53 can't be used for human sacrifice.